2020 has gotten off to a bit of a rocky start, but 2019 was also an absolute roller coaster, especially in the world of entertainment.
There's a new Sonic the Hedgehog movie, and the internet is upset about the design of the character's mouth.
Meow?
How much do you think they actually care about making this 100% real?
None, they don't care at all.
I mean, the level of negativity connected to this launch, there aren't many comparisons.
This is a real reaction. Sonic the Hedgehog's human teeth is a good reminder that there is truly no God.
The gospel album, Jesus is King, is hitting #1 across the major music genres. Kanye is openly sharing his radical faith transformation and helping to lead thousands to Christ in the process.
What do you say to people who would say, I don't believe it?
Well, I'd say, when you go to sleep, would you agree that you are asleep?
Look, I'm just shocked I've done something that upset people more than cats.
Cats.
Ultimately, this last year was a nice bookend to a decade that saw unprecedented changes in the world of television and movies. When the 2010s kicked off, Star Wars was still owned by Fox, the MCU was made up of a whopping 3 movies, and Game of Thrones was still a book series with a show in the early stages of pre-production. But by the end of the decade, each of these stories would redefine a classic genre and craft a cultural obsession with tales of superheroes, dragons, and spaceships. These sagas would also wrap up the major storylines that had been conceived earlier that same decade, but only one conclusion was met with high praise, while the other 2 failed to stick the landing. So why is one of these sagas not like the others? What's the secret sauce that the chefs at Marvel seem to have locked down that the other 2 properties can't quite replicate? It's hard to generalize these properties that have a combined runtime of 132 hours, but the key determining factor didn't take place on the screen. It was with the creators and their commitment to consistency. Just to be clear, this isn't a review of these stories. Don't let me sway you in your opinions on these experiences. This is merely an attempt to explain a common thread that played a major role in each story's overall reception, to show you how epic tales that define a decade are finalized. Simply put, this is how to conclude a saga. Let's take a look at these properties one by one. Game of Thrones faced the unusual challenge of being based on unfinished source material. Early into the production of the show, author George R.R. Martin revealed A Song of Ice and Fire's ending to these 2, creators David Benioff and D.B. Weiss. But as the seasons progressed, the show inevitably surpassed the publication of Martin's novels, thereby losing its runway and forcing the show to take flight in a new form. Benioff and Weiss were required to transform their show from an adapted screenplay into an original creation. To do so, the creators were challenged with discerning what their audiences loved so fervidly about the show, and how to carry that into the new seasons. Any longtime fan will tell you the most captivating element of the series is its predilection for killing off characters when you least expect it, its ability to subvert your expectations. So that's what Benioff and Weiss did. They took risks in an attempt to make the final season of Game of Thrones a subversive, groundbreaking thrill ride. But by making plot twists for the sole sake of surprising the audience, the creators' narrative decisions didn't always feel earned. It's impossible to say what story elements are entirely taken from Martin's future stories and what had been created by the showrunners, but there's a stark difference between the surprises seen in earlier seasons compared to those of the final season. Many of the twists created by Martin took the time to add subtle plot developments and foreshadowing that would then seem obvious to second-time viewers. One of the most iconic scenes in the series is the infamous Red Wedding that resulted in the deaths of 3 major characters. When the episode first aired, audiences were floored. No one was prepared for a massacre that horrific and that sudden. But upon second viewing, Martin's storytelling clearly laid out thematic elements that all pointed towards the perfect storm that plunged the scene into television history. As far back as season 1, Cersei Lannister proved herself a master manipulator, framing others for crimes and intentionally placing clues that make her the least likely suspect. By forcing Sansa to write a letter to her brother, Cersei goads Robb Stark into waging war with the Lannisters and takes advantage of the hot-headed young king. Throughout the 3 seasons leading up, Robb begins alienating himself from former allies in ironic attempts to build loyalty among the northern houses. Robb's pledge to marry a daughter of Walder Frey is broken after he falls in love and gets complacent. When Robb learns of his wife's pregnancy, the war-hungry Stark slows down to find that love is truly what matters. His arc completes, which leaves only one thing left: his death. Robb Stark's demise was planned from the very beginning, and every element in his story arc built towards this final gruesome scene. This perfectly illustrates George R.R. Martin's commitment to foreshadowing major plot twists to prove his storytelling expertise. While Benioff and Weiss may have been flawless in translating Martin's tales onto the screen, they failed to match the author's prowess of laying the narrative groundwork before subverting expectations. Season 8's twists felt self-contained and rushed, which led to unsatisfactory turns in character arcs. The most controversial decision in Season 8 was Daenerys' corruption into the Mad Queen. A majority of the foreshadowing of Daenerys' turn took place within the first 5 episodes of the final season, as we see the character become more frantic for the power she is gradually losing. Additionally, Benioff and Weiss attempted to retroactively point out foreshadowing from plot points early in the series. In one of the behind-the-scenes featurettes, they identified the scene of Dany overseeing the death of her brother as an example of her ruthless and power-hungry nature.
Even when you look back to season 1, when Khal Drogo gives the Golden Crown to Viserys and her reaction on watching her brother's head melted off, and he was a terrible brother, so I don't think anyone out there was crying when Viserys died, but there is something kind of chilling about the way that Dany has responded to the death of her enemies.
But this is at odds with the very nature of the world created by the author. In the pilot episode of the series, we're taught that Westeros is a savage place, where the line between hero and villain is blurred. Our protagonists are expected to act mercilessly against those that pose a threat. This is not to be seen as a character flaw, but a fact of Westerosi nature.
The man who passes the sentence should swing the sword.
Daenerys frequently acts without mercy against those that stand in the way of her vision of peace and justice, which up until the final season was a heroic quest for our protagonist to champion on her way to reclaiming her rightful throne. So when Dany does a 180 and starts killing the citizens of King's Landing, it feels like a cheap twist that goes against the motives in which she had been steadfast for so long. Jaime Lannister was another controversial example. As a piece of iconic imagery of the blurred line mentioned before, Jaime was originally presented as a villain with his only allegiance to his house, and more specifically his sister. But as the series progresses, we are informed that the eldest Lannister son is not a callous monster, but a compassionate hero trapped in a family of villains, torn between his toxic familial romance that reinforces an us versus them mentality, and an outcast brother who challenges him to do better. Throughout the series, we see that Jaime actually does care about more than just his family, and that his villainous past may not have been so villainous after all.
Tell me if your precious Randy commanded you to kill your own father and stand by while thousands of men, women and children burned alive, would you have done it? Would you have kept your oath then?
At the end of Season 7, Jaime realizes he's had enough of his sister's tyranny and finally leaves his home to fight for the North. But Benioff and Weiss completely backtrack on their own decision and the arcs built by Martin by ending Jaime's story with his return to Cersei and claiming that he never really cared for the people that he saved from the Mad King years ago.
When have I ever been able to convince Cersei of anything?
Try. If not for yourself, if not for her, then for every one of the million people in that city, innocent or otherwise.
To be honest, I never really cared much for them. Innocent or otherwise.
The finale of Game of Thrones is the result of 2 visions coordinating a story that transitions past its source material. The story suffered because the creators failed to stay consistent, not only to the character arcs, but to the reasons the show appealed to so many in the first place. But it wasn't the only series to suffer from clashing visions. The newest Star Wars film was met with a largely mixed response. The movie fell flat for critics, but has a decent support among larger audiences. But the wide consensus seems to be that The Rise of Skywalker was not the satisfying ending that fans were expecting. To fully grasp the turmoil brewing behind the camera, we need to understand how the sequel trilogy was created from its inception. At the beginning of the decade, the idea that we would be getting more Star Wars movies was unthinkable. Then, out of the blue, Disney bought Lucasfilm, announced a slate of new movies, and named 3 directors to helm the new trilogy. With the new head of Lucasfilm, Kathleen Kennedy, supervising the projects, J.J. Abrams, Rian Johnson, and Colin Trevorrow were selected to direct the films for the new trilogy. Having a separate director for each movie was not unfounded for Star Wars, seeing as the original trilogy did the same. However, this strategy was a departure from the more recent prequel trilogy that had George Lucas solely at the helm, and told a flawed but more cohesive story. Lucas provided Kennedy with story treatments for the sequel trilogy, and while several elements like characters and locations did appear in the films, his scripts were largely ignored. Come 2012, Abrams took on the colossal task of creating a film that acted as a soft reboot to the saga, satisfied the expectations of 4 decades worth of fans, and justified the $4 billion Disney buyout. So Abrams stuck to the traditional Star Wars formula. A humble hero from a desert planet finds a droid with important information, meets an old man that tells them the stories of the past, and helps destroy a superweapon threatening the galaxy. While there were some criticisms of Abrams playing it safe, for the most part, it paid off. Then, Rian Johnson stepped up to the plate. The Last Jedi had a dramatically darker and more complex tone than The Force Awakens. The movie did well critically, but might be the most controversial creation under the Star Wars banner. Many felt this film did not provide answers to the questions posed by the previous movie, while others felt that the bold direction of telling the audience that the mystery doesn't matter added to the overall experience.
I would say, but we really have to think of what the audience expects and what they want. And he says, no, we have to do the opposite. We have to give them something they don't expect that we want.
Amidst the Last Jedi internet riots of 2018, J.J. Abrams confirmed that he gave Rian Johnson vague directions on where he saw the overall story of the trilogy going, but that Rian had a lot of freedom to create his own vision. After the release of The Last Jedi, Abrams praised the movie, but not without offering some criticisms. In response to the mysteries of Snoke's origin and Rey's parentage coming to an abrupt halt, Abrams told the New York Times, "I don't think that people go to Star Wars to be told, this doesn't matter," which is very in line with Abrams' passion for keeping a mystery alive.
You look at stories, you think, well, what are stories but mystery boxes? I mean, look at Star Wars, you got the droids, they meet the mysterious woman, who's that, we don't know, mystery box,
Up next was Colin Trevorrow. Before The Last Jedi was even released, Trevorrow penned a rough script for Episode 9 called Duel of the Fates. Not long after the creation of the script, Lucasfilm parted ways with Trevorrow, citing creative differences. After Trevorrow was let go from Episode 9, Abrams took up the role to finish the trilogy he had started. This gave him the opportunity to provide definitive answers to the mysteries he had created in The Force Awakens. The Last Jedi attempted to close those stories in a way that didn't give you a straight answer. It doesn't matter who Snoke is, because he's more of a plot device to fuel Kylo's arc. It doesn't matter who Rey is, because you don't need a royal lineage to make a difference in the galaxy. The Rise of Skywalker made it clear that JJ wasn't satisfied with those answers. So JJ provided the answers he wanted via one test tube villain and the mental image of Palpatine getting it on. In doing so, Episode 9 feels disconnected from the movie that came before it. Disney was unsatisfied with the divisive reception of The Last Jedi and wanted something that would unite audiences in the same fashion as Avengers Endgame. With production wrapping in late November, Disney was able to point to Marvel and effectively tell Abrams, do what they did. Disney wanted a safer movie that gave answers, tied up loose ends, and satisfied the fans. But the creators of these films had the freedom to make vastly different movies because the story of the trilogy was not written out from the beginning. With Abrams' history of creating mysteries that wind up convoluting his endings, Star Wars was left in critical condition after the narrative whiplash from director to director. The dramatically inconsistent tones of this trilogy may have proved to be a financial success as isolated films, but it also led to a dissatisfied fan base. All in an effort to make the least offensive film that appealed to the largest possible audiences. All in an effort to recreate the success of Marvel. film franchises don't necessarily have to have every story beat planned out from day one. Marvel is the perfect example. With a wide cast of characters and heroes that build out their universe, the franchise doesn't need each film's plot to bleed into the next. Thor is not a sequel to Iron Man. Ant-Man is not a prequel to Doctor Strange. From the very first movie, Marvel's motto seemed to be, take a risk. Take a risk on a blacklisted actor who's attempting to revive his career. Take a risk on a superhero team-up film. Take a risk that your audience will come into the final 2 movies having understood and remembered the important themes and character arcs from the previous 19 films. Marvel was able to build an audience not solely because of its source material. Marvel Comics had been around for decades, but none of the movies are faithful adaptations of story arcs from graphic novels, even if they share the same name. In most cases, directors handpicked which story elements, if any, they wished to incorporate into their films. By not creating strict adaptations, Marvel could afford to select a diverse team of directors and give them a long leash to have fun with their movies. You want some Shakespeare with your superheroes? Hire Kenneth Branagh. How about a quippy team-up movie? Joss Whedon's your guy. And if you want a zany space comedy, you get James Gunn. The directors of the MCU were masters of building on top of the previous movies to create an expansive universe. By not contradicting each other, the films were able to run a narrative relay race to specific milestone movies, namely the Avengers films. The easiest way to showcase this is through their iconic use of the post-credits scene. Each scene makes an intentional effort to tee up a plot point for a future film. Sometimes these will set up stories that the same director will create, but many times they'll set up a cameo or a tease for the next film on the docket. The Avengers films were always the spine of the franchise. Each movie crafted the most plot developments that built towards the Infinity Saga finale. This allowed directors more freedom to get creative with their stories. You could make a Guardians of the Galaxy that was heavy with Infinity Saga content, providing lore on the Infinity Stones, explaining the creation of the universe, and making Thanos a secondary villain. Or you could make a Captain America Civil War, with no lore building to the finale, no Thanos, and no Infinity Gem MacGuffins. Instead, it builds its plot on the intricate character motivations and story arcs that will intertwine in the final films. And these character dynamics fueled people's interests in the Avengers films. When the first movie was announced, audiences were eager to see how a man who had seen the horrors of war would interact with a war profiteer. How would a Norse god interact with a sarcastic super spy played by Samuel L. Jackson? Watching these diverse personalities realistically charm, argue, and fight each other added a deeper layer to a film that could have just relied on 6 heroes fighting a CGI army. As the MCU expanded, more personalities filled the roster that people wanted to see interact. And through a combination of character-accurate dialogue and expert performances from the actors, audiences were not only given a summer action blockbuster, they were given a superhero soap opera as well. What's important is that Marvel creators never lost sight of what fans enjoyed about the movies. They also never contradicted each other. Films may have abandoned storylines that were teased, but no story points were ever outright reworked on screen. The Russo brothers directed 4 films in the MCU, including the 2-part finale of the Infinity Saga. But Infinity War and Endgame brought together storylines and characters from almost all previous films. And there's way more than you think. Doctor Strange's pledge to protect the Time Stone, T'Challa's unification of Wakanda, Natasha's guilt of her KGB past, Star-Lord's romance with Gamora, Steve's search to find his place in a world that doesn't need him, Tony's mentorship of Peter, Tony's growth into his ultimate selfless sacrifice, and so many more. Crafting that level of detail into your characters takes time. Movies are so much more than what you see on screen. They're a product of the work and planning of hundreds of artists that labor tirelessly behind the screen. But with huge teams working to keep iconic titles alive, an artist's vision can get lost in the process. When building a saga, creators need a plan, and they need to stick to that plan. Maybe your plan is to give creators freedom and have a select few movies pick up the slack on the lore. Maybe your strategy is to meticulously map out a trilogy before filming begins. Maybe your strategy is to work closely with your source material even if audiences may have already predicted the ending. 2 of these sagas changed course throughout production, leaving a disjointed and inconclusive story. Avengers succeeded in concluding its story because Marvel understood what audiences enjoyed and made a commitment to creativity. Marvel succeeded because it was consistent.
Everybody wants a happy ending, but it doesn't always roll that way. Maybe this time. I'm hoping if you play this back, it's in celebration.